Hello, I'm Scott Richards, and welcome to the Break It Down show. Looking forward to having a great conversation with Pete on a range of topics.
That's right. We're going to get rangy here, like we often do. So one of the things that's cool about Scott and myself is, we have the experience to have these conversations that literally very few people in the world can have because we have been to these places, we have seen them, and in Scott's, in my cases, we have seen these things from different perspectives in different countries, working for different countries. And so you start to get a pattern. You go, oh, this is how these things work or don't work in this case. And so we've written papers, we've written things, and oftentimes like, oh, we've written the same paper from a different perspective, and I think we're all going to enjoy this conversation. So, hey, thanks for coming on the show, man. And it's been a real kick talking to you offline. It's been fascinating reading your Substack. I'm going to put a link to your Substack up right now, but I guess just get us started while I work on your Substack link.
Yeah, I mean, it's a pleasure to talk and, really kind of get more kind of knowledge and background on what it is that you've done. I think the thing that made the experience for me sort of different was I never worked. Well, I mean, I began my political career in Australia as an advisor to the advisor of the Prime Minister, so I had a very deep orientation in politics. But when it came to working with countries like Afghanistan or in Africa and other areas, I never worked for the big NGOs. I never worked really for the development agencies, and I never worked. I always worked for the host nation directly, such as Afghanistan, where I was seconded to Giroa with the Ministry of Finance at first, and then law enforcement after that. And so it's very interesting coming in as a Westerner and then sitting on the side of the table with the government, learning about what their priorities are, and then taking those priorities to what was RS or whoever else it was at the time, or MEC or oversight coordination body. That approach, I guess, is kind of really key to the different view that I think that I have, and seeing things from a different experience, and that's really compatible with yours, which I guess has an element of frustration and seeing the mistakes that we're making by misorientation of policy and directive.
Yeah. And I guess I'll just put a bit of a disclaimer in here too for everybody. We're going to be pretty critical of a system. The people themselves, look, we're all trying our hardest. We've all read books, we've all got degrees. Everybody's trying their damnedest and wanting to have great outcomes. This is all very difficult work. And I'm positive Scott will say the same thing, so I won't speak for him, but I have made all of the mistakes. I've made all of them. And I've just slowly stopped making certain mistakes. And one of the biggest mistakes was just not shutting up and having too much ego. And once you learn to shut up and have less ego, you start to realize, oh, these guys actually know how to do certain things. And if I just get out of the way, and how do I sprinkle in the tiniest bit of help? That's all they need. And then you can realize how effective they are.
I would 100% agree with that, and I think whether it's just career time or that. Because I had experience with Libya before Afghanistan, but it's just such a different culture that just when I hit the ground, and it's quite disorientating when you at first to absorb all the culture, to absorb the differences, the myriad of ethnic groups that are there, the subtleties in different belief systems. That there really was no choice but to listen. And then they had, at that time, a really brilliantly educated layer of people who were Fulbright scholars, through all the ministries. Um, and I think at that point, I'd spend quite a bit of time with some, retired tier one guys. So my attitude really was working with them and privileged to work with them was just get out of their way and let them do what they do. Um, and you kind of really hit the nail on the head is you see so much more when you're not afraid to admit that you don't know something or to listen or learn or to feel that you have to have something to input, yet that you have to make a display of yourself. When you get away, as you say, from the ego, it just the world is infinitely larger.
Yeah, and the more the person working, and I'm going to use Americans as an example, but this is a universal Western value. The more
Mm.
they were concerned about how they were perceived internally within their organization, the more of a problem they were. You can't give a damn about what your boss or your boss's boss thinks, because your job is to, especially in my case, is to get off of the main route, go see the elders, go meet the warlords, and go understand these people. And if like my job is to help the commander win. And if I'm out there going, hey, we are not winning today, that's bad news. But that's my job, is to go find out like what is and isn't working. And isn't working is something the commander can fix just as easily as he can add more weight to the is working side of things. I love your cat. It's awesome back there.
Yeah. The cat
So
was always going to be a feature of this.
yeah, no, it's great. I hope my cat comes in. But these things where you get off the main route and you're like, I'm not worried about up, right? So I sat in
Yeah.
a meeting in Basra with the Americans, and they were getting ready to like wrap up their tour. And this is like a division. This is thousands of
Mhm.
people, and a general is running a working group. That's how high level it is. And they were trying to decide, like, should we build the victory tower or not, and what's our recommendation to the commander. And there's the senior
Wow.
political advisor and all these people are there talking, and they're like, you don't forget the senior ambassador is coming, and we must be making sure that this and this, and we'll tell the governor what to do, the Iraqi governor. And I just raised my hand, and I always do this, like, is this an actual working group, or we're talking about things and we can, or are we just shutting up? And they're like, no, we want to hear what you have to say. I do not belong to this group, by the way. I've been invited. And so I say, regarding the victory tower, has anyone asked the governor what's important to him? Because
Hmm.
we're leaving. And they're like, what? Ask the governor. And I'm like, because, we're leaving. What's like the most important, like, what are the three things he needs to govern right now? Like,
Hmm.
we're leaving. And so after the meeting, I was in the chow hall, and all of these officers came up to me and they're like, thanks for saying that, man. Because they were so worried about this stupid American-driven American tower. The poll
Hmm.
ad was all for, right? But nobody had asked the Iraqis. No one had even been honest with them, saying, no shit, we're leaving. Like, what are you going to need? Because you are going
Hmm.
to be the government here in about 6 weeks.
Hmm.
Maybe it's 12 weeks. Maybe it's 16 weeks, but no shit, it's going to be you here quick. And when you told these guys that, when you were honest with these Iraqi leaders, their
Hmm.
eyes would bug out of their head. They're like, no, you're not leaving. And we're like, I swear to God, we're never going to be back here. And they'd been
Hmm.
like, let me make a list. And they wouldn't get the things they needed. And you're like, holy shit, this is really going to be hard for these guys, And they started to have to make alternate plans. And you saw
Hmm.
reality hit them in the face. Meanwhile, we're talking about the fucking victory tower.
Yeah. I mean, you saw before I first started working in Afghanistan, I read the NATO reports going quite a way back, and I had been involved in stuff in Africa to do with Boko Haram before, so I wasn't unfamiliar with the terrain of Islamic jihadism. I wasn't unfamiliar with these things. But it said by 2007 that they wanted to disarm all militants. By 2008 or 9, have girls all in school, and by 2000 whatever.
Oh,
And it was
yeah.
like these were just ridiculous ambitions written by somebody that had clearly never really been to the country. And that's when I realized the thinking was taking place in London or DC, and it was taking place by people that don't have cultural depth. And then when you get on the ground, what you see is people come in for a tour of 6 months, maybe 2 at 12, and these are relationship countries. I've been living in the Middle East for 17 years now. And it takes years to build
Oh,
relationships. It takes years to
yeah.
build understanding. And to the Afghan example, they knew that these guys were going to rotate out, so they just stopped taking them seriously. But we would, when I was with the Ministry of Finance, we were trying to build the commercial court because the problem they had was the banking sector couldn't initiate lending or stimulate small business or medium business because no loans. Um, and we got the Higher Economic Council behind it, everybody behind it, and we went to RS and all the embassies, and they're disinterested. And this is the one thing, one of the things the economy would have really benefited from. But there was nothing. If something wasn't brewed inside the confines of DC or one of the contracting companies or wherever or whoever, it was just ignored. And so I ignored. We met with the justice sector. We worked with them. We worked with drones. Like, what are our weaknesses? What can we develop up to make more effect, to reduce friction? Anything that, and I say this about anyone as a tech entrepreneur or working in politics, if you want to make progress, what you're functionally doing is reducing friction in an action. But it was just, I sat on oversight coordination body, which was the body that reviewed all the activities of the donor money. I was on that, and I would see contracts come up, and it was like, oh, we couldn't do it because of security. We only got 20% of the project done. Project renamed, project refunded, incumbent employed. I was like, this guy, stop. So we, it was once an incident attributable to Obama, I think, and he was right. And he said that we fought 21-year wars.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
it's just not the way to do this. And it was incredibly depressing because, people would say, we spent $2.3 trillion in Afghanistan. I'm like, go on the ground, show me. It's not there. It's in salaries of contractors and things and whatever. And there wasn't even any ammunition left when the Taliban came. It wasn't even there. It wasn't even rockets or 7.62. It was nowhere. It was just, we can't keep repeating these mistakes, because the net effect on this, the moral basis for any of these conflicts, leaving that aside, because that's a difficult one. But if there are going to be interventions, we are claiming moral basis. We are claiming to go and do nation building. Then we need to do this in a serious manner, because it harms the prestige of the West, but it also harms the belief in the West as coming here to transform lives and being anything as a serious body. We start. It is fair of these countries to look at it and say, is this neocolonialism? They're coming in here, getting rich, albeit off taxpayer dollars, not so much our resources, but it's a different diversion of capital, and we just can't keep doing this.
Boy, yeah, we can't keep doing it, right? And it's a true redistribution of wealth. And when there's not enough, and we are the corrupting force, and I'm saying we as the Americas or the coalition that we bring. Here comes the World Bank, because the U.S. is a guarantor of this energy. And I would say President Obama got it only half right. Sure, 21-year wars, but with total amnesia as to what had been done before.
Oh,
so
I love the phrase lessons learned. We learned none.
Yeah. So year 15, we're still saying how many schools in the valley. And I'm like, no. What are the lesson plans? Who are the teachers? Who are the kids that have already graduated school? You're asking the wrong questions, and oh my God, and by the way, when the Taliban or one Talib in a valley is complaining because we did something to the Quran. Understand, when they burn down a school, there's also a Quran in that school, and they burned it down. So you can't even have a conversation about that because you're so ignorant about the religion. 15 or 20 years in, that amnesia as to what a unit did, even if it's the same damn unit there 10 years later, you can't win that way. You can't forget what's happened, and you can't drive your partner crazy because, as you said, you're completely ineffective, and you promise and never deliver these things. We saw that over and over again.
And it's incredible, and it's distressing on the people we're supposing to help. It's distressing on the people doing the mission. I mean, you look at the mental health element, from the withdrawal, from what happened when you were during there, even if it's non-combat. These are psychologically traumatic because you do see so much suffering. And if you go in there as believing in the mission, and then try to convince these people of your purpose, then that's distressing as well. To come back to what you said is a very important point. That's something I talk about a lot. Something I did talk about. I read a massive presentation for corruption in 2016 for the Road to Warsaw. And we have all these organizations talking about corruption and whatever else, but nobody talked about the psychology of corruption. And so what we really touched on was the idea of, okay, what is corruption? Well, corruption is where somebody misuses power against another party. Now, if you're talking about a bribe, that's because you believe that if you don't pay the bribe, you're not going to get what you want. Or if you're talking about a policy you pay, you're not going to get what you want. And so you're compelled in this circumstance where paying a bribe is a rational choice. If you're in a situation where you don't see a future for your country as a politician, you're in a position where getting as much money as you can and buying a property somewhere else to run away to a bolt hole is a rational decision. And so we have to look at what makes what makes corruption become enabling. And the sheer amount of money that the West put into Afghanistan without proper oversight, resistance really to oversight, and there was always the excuses, oh, this is just how it's done. It's like, no, it's not. It doesn't need to be this way. I mean, at one point I remember arguing with RS saying, if you want to identify corruption, you need to disincentivize it. And then if you want to have corruption reporting, you need to make it accessible. Can we just get a goddamn phone line and put up some posters? I'll pay for the posters and laminate them myself. And let's just put them in a few places where people do cash transactions. So if they feel that they were bribed, they can make a call and put a camera there, right? So they can be anonymous or whatever else. See the time of day it took. And it's not going to cost us a lot. But let's start making some changes, because if you can't report corruption and if there's no action taken, I say a lot about law enforcement. Law enforcement's about detection. Intelligence is about prediction and anticipation to a degree. But that's the unique thing of law enforcement. It's always after the fact. And the only way it becomes preventative is if the risk analysis somebody's taking internally, do I steal, do I lie, is if they believe the probability of detection is high enough. That's the only dissuasion. It's not. You can't call it preventative. You can only call it dissuasive.
Yeah, boy, you said a lot of stuff right there. And, and I don't want to slide completely into Ukraine already, but when you look at, in general, how we behaved in Iraq and Afghanistan, and then you apply these lessons to Ukraine, you start to notice like I always talked about like what we bring instability, and until we can accept that we are our presence equals instability, and until you accept that premise, you cannot create stability, because you're like, hey, I'm a net destabilizer. No, I'm not. I'm here to do good. Well, your desire and your outcome are not in alignment. And so like when I talk to people and I say, we're going to corrupt these people, absolutely, 100%. And they're like, no, not this time. Like, what do you mean not this time? Like, what on earth is going to be different? We're going to bring a shitload of money. We're going to pick the wrong people, because we always do this. We're going to see people through a threat lens. This is my intel side, and I'm gonna read the dossier on Ukrainian businessman 15, and we're gonna go, aha, ties to the Kremlin, tied to Putin, tied to mobsters. Of course, he's a former Soviet dude. He's still alive. He's 62 years old. Of course, it's like Mullah Omar was alive in the province where I lived. So of course, everybody there was tied to the Taliban. Of course. So everybody gets a negative sheet, right? And how are you gonna get an intel guy? How are you gonna get a two shop? A two shop is intel people, by the way. How are you gonna get intel people to go, oh yeah, that guy's okay now? Like, who is ever rehabilitated without extreme measures their presence? It just doesn't happen, right? And so we're going to pick the wrong people. We always do.
I mean, the whole. I have part of my problems with the way that Intel functions in that respect is that I always say study the man, study the person, not study the metrics. Because if you're looking at like almost like a rap sheet of link analysis attached to so and so, attached to so and so. Okay. That tells me that their associations are potentially there with the ability to move social capital or political capital. Great. What I really want to know is, what does this person care about? What motivates them? I want to watch their personality operate. I want to watch how they make decisions. I want to see what they respond to, what their lines are with pressure. And then I want to understand how. We have a saying, a friend of mine taught me this phrase. He's a political advisor, very experienced. And he said, the job of a political advisor is to bring out the best self and not the worst self in a person. So when you look at any opportunity you have for negotiation, again, like corruption, you don't want to make hostility rational, because it can be perfectly logical within their context. And I try to look at sometimes, Western policy and say, okay, this looks irrational, but there is a logic to it. Right. So when you get to work with the people, if I've spent time with the Mujahideen and everybody else, the old guys that are out fighting the Soviets, not necessarily told I was going to a meeting, just have to go there and talk. But what I saw in every conversation was that everybody wants the children to have a better future. They may just have differing opinions about what that means. And I've even had conversations with Taliban where one this is before the fall, where a Taliban was speaking to actually got an elder to open a girls' school, because it's about how you enter the conversations, it's about how you do these things. And so I feel when we kind of break these things down into grids, we become oblivious to the fact that people are messy, but they are predictable.
Yeah.
And we don't understand what it is to put them in a situation where we compel them to a better choice. And for me, it's, as I say, it's, as you said as well, it's about the people. It's not
Mm.
the politics. And although I'm functionally a political animal, I'm never in a room for political gain for myself, never in a room for political gain for a party. Um, Only in a room to look at, okay, this is a problem. We agree to find the problem, and then to understand what it takes and to give a clear picture as to what an action has in terms of value to the population. And so I've worked with, written papers for when there's been a Republican government. I've written papers when there's a Democrat government. I don't really care. If you're going to do something seriously, then let's do it. And let's take all
Yeah.
that stuff out of it. And then actually you'll get your political win because you'll be the guy that did something.
And a lot of times the thing you do is not a damned thing. You go to that Afghan, that Iraqi sheikh, and you're like, what's the least thing that I can do to help you? To
That's a
include
good way of
doing
putting
nothing. And then they go, you
it.
know
Yeah.
what? I don't need a thing from you. Do you mind if I watch or should I just stay away? No, you know what? I don't want you around for this one. I'll tell you about it later. Okay. You just take off, man. And you're like, cool. And then you come back a week later and he's like, here's what happened. I took pictures for
Yep.
you. And I also
Yep.
brought Bob. Bob's going to tell you independently from me, ask him whatever
Yeah.
questions you want. And then Bob's like, oh man, it was awesome. Let me tell you what he did. And you're like, holy shit. And you write it all down. I swear to God, these things, I'm not talking to you.
Mhm.
Scott knows this stuff. I'm talking to you all inside this camera. I swear to God, this stuff happens. If you just shut the fuck up and let them do
Mhm.
things, they know what to do. And if you say, I have no help to offer, they go, I don't need your help.
Yeah.
Or you say, I have help to offer. Like, they're like, can you bring some water? You know, like, all right, we'll bring some water. I want to show you an image, man. I think you'll appreciate this. So I built up a lot of trust. This is like the thing I learned to do
Mhm.
is like focus on trust. And I have to extend it. I'm the American. I have a bank of trust. So I extend my trust out. I put
Yep.
myself in harm's way. I go, I'm
Mhm.
here. I want to learn your ways. You show me. Ultimately, in this case, equals me being called out by name to a meeting with the Talib in the area.
Mhm.
And I don't know this, right? And so I
Mhm.
sit in and I get vouched for by the Taliban because I'm operating within the bounds of what they allow in this
Mhm.
valley, right? So this is the thing. So we asked the governor, what is his plan, right? And we don't have to go through the whole plan, but the idea here is this
Mhm.
is his plan. And like, this is how he
Mhm.
wants to run his district. And
Mhm.
this guy is Mujahideen. He's a governor, one of the senior governors in the
Yep.
province, and he's also a holy man. But when the villagers talk to him, they use the religious leader term. They don't call him governor.
Mhm.
They don't call him colonel.
Mhm.
And so that teaches you like about this area and how they respect this guy. Now, the problems start to come in that there is no government to provision his plan. We were
Mhm.
leaving the area. The final thing I want to say about this is he's like, my number one priority is to put girls in school. And I'm like, oh, this is
Yeah.
awesome. This will be a great report. How do we do that? He's like, well, the first thing we do, remember, number one priority is girls. First thing we do is we have to have security. The Afghan dude has to be able to leave his house and go to work safely. That's
Mhm.
number one. Number two is the compound has to be safe when the man leaves. Okay. All right. Well, that's okay.
Mhm.
Well, the girls are waiting in line, but okay, that's two. Three, the kids have to be able to go to school and come back. That's the third element of security that
Mhm.
has to happen before priority number one. Okay, great. Then four, the boys have to be educated because boys have to be educated to keep our economy alive. And then finally, we can get to the priority number one of girls educating. It took me a week to understand
Hmm.
that in a way that I can explain it that easily, And so this stuff is often very, and you know this, very
Hmm.
deliberate, delicate work. But that whole chart took a long time, months to build, so I could explain that to the Army, to the State Department. And even then, we never made any progress on that plan. Never, because there was no government.
Yep.
The military was leaving, and so it was all just an illustration of what maybe could have been one day, but it never happened.
I mean, I noted that you had wrestling in there. So one of the things that a lot of people don't appreciate is the importance of sport and culture, and technically the arts. So when we were tackling part of Australia, which had the worst resident satisfaction score, the first thing we did was we brought in a soccer pitch, and then we got the Australian national football team to train there. And suddenly, all these people, which in an area has high rates of alcoholism, domestic violence, everything else, they got suddenly feel like, oh wow, we have the national team here. We matter. And over time, graffiti disappeared. Alcoholism went down. Created thousands of jobs. Just because
Mm,
suddenly people were invested in their lives because they didn't feel they were worth nothing. And so when you give people an opportunity to have belief, and you give them, we ask for belief, but then we tend not to deliver on it. When you deliver on belief, you have transformation, because then you get people
yeah.
vested in something. Um, I mean, that's it. And so when you had that on that chart, that note of risk, yeah, that's smart, because you need activities for young men. You need activities that will keep them occupied, because hate the phrase, but it's a real thing. Fighting age males, and that's they're an exploitable population for recruitment, desperation, whatever else. There's just no. We wanted to have this transformative idea to make these countries into mirrors in some ways of the West, and that's wholly wrong. I mean, I remember having conversations at RS, and they were talking about marriage, young girls getting married. I'm like, okay, break this down. It's an economic choice for one, with dowry. Number two, we haven't created value in the girl, which would prevent her being, apart from the economic cost, taken away from the family or whatever else, for marriage. And it's tradition. So you go on, they want to educate girls or whatever else. Well, you know what? You talk about the provinces, whatever else. Why don't you start teaching skills that she needs in her life when she works with her dad's farm? How to manage basic accounting, right? Create some value in her, and economic value.
Yeah.
It may not be an opportunity for her to go and win, a science prize and on the international stage, but you'll have a future. And
Mm,
then your education is just a threatening thing. So if she becomes a contributing member because of her skill set, in that context, now we're changing the perception of education, and we're building education in context. And everyone's like, wow, that's amazing. Like, nothing happens. But we're not designing solutions in context, you know.
yeah.
Um, and everybody should have the opportunity. I believe, in everybody should have the opportunity to realize the full scope of their talents and expertise. So whatever they could do in life, male, female, whatever, whoever, whatever. But the reality is, most of the world doesn't have that end game.
No.
So how do we get most people to get more out of their lives than they're presently getting, or getting a more secure life, knowing it may not be perfect, but let's just start somewhere,
Yeah.
and not try to have like, oh, well, it's not this grandiose standard. Well, these people don't have clean water, or they
Yeah.
don't have sanitation. You would see in Afghanistan, people washing their clothes where they defecate in the river. Let's teach them about trench slits. Okay, let's get the dysentery down. Let's start
Yeah.
somewhere simple that's self-managed and not invasive. But we create this lofty need, um, to say that everything has to be this, it has to be that. We've set these standards in the West. Not that our own education is that great in many places, but why are we doing this here?
Yeah.
It's nuts.
It's a great point. I'm actually peer reviewed, published on female engagement in Afghanistan,
Hmm.
and we did the same thing in Iraq, and we didn't treat it like a serious thing. We treated it like this fantasy, and even You got two dudes as the primary authors on this, and whenever we briefed it or talked about it to
Yeah.
women in particular, they would get mad that we were even talking about it, and they'd want to know which women we were talking about, and they would tell us before we'd even discuss the context of the paper that all women are empowered, and we're like, yeah. So we haven't even talked about the paper, and we're already in a fight, And it's like, look,
Hmm.
you can't just walk into any valley in Afghanistan and put your stuff on anybody else. One,
No,
you don't know what's going to happen 10 minutes after you leave that valley. You might get that woman killed or
I'd say
beat
you
to
just
death.
get her killed.
Yeah.
And
So you just can't do it, right? And you like your point is so valid. Like, yeah, you could want to teach them how to work a loom or how to raise chickens, but if you can't do that without reducing harm, don't you dare
I think
do
it's
it.
wrong.
Yeah.
I mean,
So the point being, when you have these high ideals, do you have sanitation? Is a great point. Like, hey, let's bring them
mm,
clean water. I learned this from an Aussie. He's like, you guys always want to bring clean water. What do you do with the wastewater? And I'm like, oh, fuck me. I never thought about that.
yeah,
Yeah. What do you, gray and black water, where does it go? And every single person I talked to in Iraq, when we talked about water, they're like, we have waste. We have waste and we
yeah.
have no way to get rid of it all the time. They would say, Maku Mai, Maku care about bad water, bad electricity. And I'm like, oh
Hmm.
shit. And so it was such a problem. So we're over here worrying about clean water, and these guys have so much dirty water and no way to clean it, no way to process it, And so we never think about these things, and we think about the solution in a place that I call it the spaceship. They think of the solution in a spaceship, and it's like you can't do that. Okay, great, get us started in the spaceship, but then send Pete and Scott out and go, hey, how's that idea working? Hey, man, too far ahead of everybody down here.
Hmm.
Today, we're just trying to, and like when you think of farmer solutions, if you don't know farmers, stop thinking of solutions for them. Like the
Hmm.
farmers are going to say, leave me alone, don't talk to
Hmm.
me, get out of my way. That's the first thing they say. And then they're going to say, you want to help me? Give me feed and seed. And then just leave me alone. Don't tell me how to raise crops on my land. And until you
Yep.
earn the right to tell them how to do it, don't do it.
Sorry about that. My cat was just walking across. Speaking of children education.
Your cats are the best. Anyhow,
Oh, that
and
test.
so I want to bring in like Ukraine into this because Ukraine
Oh,
doesn't need any help farming, but we're going to be desperate to tell these farmers how to do things. We're going to be bringing in modern technology. We're,
yep.
we're we're not going to be able to help ourselves.
Oh, Jesus. Sorry. Bit of profanity there. Yeah. So I mean, Ukraine worried me from the onset that we would see, the contractor bonanza of all the aid agencies, all the development agencies. And I've had experience with these agencies on both sides of the fence. Um, and because they'll be looking at cats
Kidding.
are obsessed with this. Uh, they will be looking because how can I put this? We built over 20 years an infrastructure that was generating huge amounts of wealth, whether that's the dying cause, the commodities, the DAIs, the whoever else. Now, without conflict and development or crisis, they don't have. I don't know why the cat's trying to learn English right now. Um, cat. Um, yeah, so they need to have a funnel for work. And so when you have a conflict like Ukraine, where billions and billions of dollars spoil up, they'll sit in the border of Poland and Ukraine, and they're all looking to do various things. And you are right; they are going to come in and they're going to say, "Okay, we're going to try to teach." Ukraine is the largest exporter of one of the largest exporters of food in the world, and it's just that arrogance that we have, and we see it in with Presidium. When it was true, and probably we were for a while the only aid agency that was delivering the front lines. And there probably are some others now that are doing that. But so you have these huge entities spooling up around, but nobody's getting materials to where people need. And we were doing civilian relief.
Yeah.
Um, and it's always, there's no coordination between everything. Everyone's competitive and domiciled. And so, you may need materials for bandages or amputees. And somebody's got them and you don't. So you're not getting integration between people who are supposedly there to help people. Our focus was, always civilian. We delivered 70,000 liters of water to cancer hospitals. We've delivered tons of food. We've had to beg, borrow, and steal, and we've
Yeah.
never received any funding from any, except from some donations from some people. But as far as being one of the most effective organizations, because if you don't play in that model, you just kind of get ignored, and being
Right.
ignored has a value if you get to do the real work, but you don't get any help whatsoever. We did a lot of evacuation from Afghanistan, and very little donation whatsoever went into that. But we got people out, and we never did in a way where we got people out where someone was trapped. Make sure there's a clear path for immigration, so you don't have people sitting in safe houses in expiring visas. In Ukraine, we evacuated over 600 orphans. 70% of those were disabled. Rehomed them in high-quality care homes in Europe. So you have to plan those things out. But I just see, a contractor bonanza. And you are right. We're going to come back and say, oh, how do we rebuild Ukraine? And we are going to be ignorant of culture. We are going to be, ignorant of how their economy functions. We're going to be ignorant of so many things. And then, as you said, to something you very wisely said, is that we're cause net instability. In any economy, if you bring in a sudden injection of capital and resource, you are going to transform the economy. Aid will do that ordinarily, and aid is often problematic because people don't understand the aid has impact on economies. When we talk about resilience, a word that most people don't understand, what that means to build resilience. So you are absolutely right. We will be creating our own form of instability, and it may be with good intentions, or it may be part of geopolitics or whatever you want to ascribe the meaning of that to. But for whatever reason, we're there, and we're there with bucket loads of cash and bucket loads of supposed expertise, which is often not really expertise. It's filling seats in a contract to bump it up to get more cash.
Boy, you said it there. Putting butts in seats, that obligates the contract. It's not performance, right? It's
Yep.
Can you put a person with the right resume in the right seat? And then that's it. That's all that's required. You can put 0 on the board every day. As long as that butt is in that seat, that's all that matters.
Mm-hmm.
That is
Mm-hmm.
the right thing. Ukraine is full of minerals and fertilizer. There's ammonia like crazy. There's
Yep.
natural gas. All of these things, and there's so much money in that. So there's areas for corruption in banking, in mining, in industrial work, obviously in all of the natural gas and the gas and oil industry. There's so much area because that money has to flow through. And that means
Mm-hmm.
even being a secondary player, if you sell tires to the people who drive trucks in and out of
Yep.
all that refining and everything, you will make billions of dollars, right?
Yep.
And so all of that stuff is corruptible. It's just corruptible. And when you were like, hey, we're going to bring you all the tires you need, that dude that sells tires,
Yep.
he gets cut out. And all of a sudden, you have real problems. And again, we're bad at picking the right people. And so we're going to cut someone out. Someone's going to be like, oh, that guy over there, ooh, he's tied to the mob. And all he
Mm-hmm.
really is, he's just Dave, and he's like, I'm not tied to the mob. I've been selling tires for 40 years. I'm the guy that sells tires around here. And we'll cut Dave out. And then Dave will be like, well, you guys cut me out. So here's what I'm going to do. And he'll do the next thing. And hopefully it's not a
Mm-hmm.
nefarious thing. But sometimes it is a nefarious thing. And we create a lot of our own. And that's part of how we create instability is Dave now has to find a different way to
Mm-hmm.
live. And it shoves something out that is there, whether it's nefarious or just competition. And I know, like in Iraq, a lot of times they use bombs for
Mm-hmm.
in unstable areas. Bombs are communication. Hey, kaboom! I don't want you
Yep.
here anymore. And then Larry gets the message from Dave, and he's like, "I'm out," and he goes somewhere else.
Yep.
So that instability can come in a lot of forms.
I mean, what happens when you introduce that amount of capital or any amount of change is you create displacement.
Mm.
And then that creates long-term effects on people's lives. And then we run into other areas of convergence. And that's something that I talk about a lot, is looking at trends where they converge in unpredictable ways, or otherwise known as, I guess, tertiary and secondary effects, but more driven by a sense of conversion rather than causality effect. It's an application. So there's a subtle difference in how that occurs. But these are very real questions that don't get modeled, that don't get asked. We just think money is the answer to everything. And you, Ukraine was a terribly corrupt environment. I have experience, there sort of before the war in that regard with certain things that are difficult to talk about throughout names of what happened. But to expect that if we introduce large amounts of money, large amounts of things, empower certain people, that we aren't going to change the socio-political structure, we're wrong. And if we're going to be readjusting, well, not necessarily possibly us, but or Ukraine will be readjusting, whether through with influence of the West or not, for years to come. I was going to say something about Afghanistan on this, and I can't remember what my train of thought was. Corruption, about enablement of corruption. It'll come back to me.
Okay. Yeah.
But again, it's where we see parallels in things.
Yeah, no, that's why we do use these parallels of Iraq, Afghanistan, Africa, these places where we go with good intention, right? And like, hey, we have a program for this, but okay. So here's the things: is we often will bring a bunch of money, and we fall in love with the program, but then there's no external accountability for that program, and so we'll self-report that, hey, this is working, and then it's not. It's not. It's all a
No.
performance because everyone's incented for it to work, to include the recipient of the help, because there's a lot of money there with no accountability. Boy, that sounds, as I say that sounds delicious to me. How can I get some of that sweet, sweet, low accountability money? Oh my
Yeah, I
gosh.
mean, I made the material choice when I was working in Afghanistan, because I would do asset seizure for litigations and investigations at the time. And so that would be my revenue. I was never paid by anyone, because I knew the day would come when someone would say to me, you went to Afghanistan, you made money as a contractor, you were just there to cut some of that, that sweet money with little safeguard. And so many years of my life have been dedicated to that. I never took a dollar. And that was a conscious choice, because maintenance of integrity, is critically important.
Yeah.
And that has kind of served me well. I can't go really into the specifics of this with the names, but obviously I'm working on the hostage release of the Britons. And I was speaking to a very important figure who's been providing some guidance and assistance from the region, from another country. And he's like, oh, I had a conversation with them today, meeting the Taliban, the IAA, and the Haqqani side. And they go, they remember you. I'm like, oh man, this isn't going to be good. This is making it in my head. I'm thinking, but they said, yes, we remember Scott. He was a man of integrity and honesty, and if he's involved, these people are not lying or deceptive. And so to be able to always stand in a position where the people that you're concerned, the politics are not, and not to lie
right.
or dissemble.
Yeah.
Like I read a lot of stuff in the news and Twitter and things that I know about, or I was essentially there. Like, that's not what happened. This does not resemble anything of what actually occurs. This is not. We're putting this veneer over all media communications related to geopolitics that is meant to show the action supporting a narrative. And it supports the narrative at all costs, to where it becomes completely delusionary. And then it's like, if we're making policy off of these statements, we're in trouble.
Yeah.
Because it's not reflective. And I was trying to remember what I was going to say, because it was actually to do with a recent conversation with the Taliban. Because I have been talking to them on economics recently. I'm trying to wait for it to come back to me because it was important. But you'd be surprised in the right way, the profound conversations that you can actually have. There's this idea that everybody is that your enemy, and this is typical with conversations around Ukraine, which is why one of the reasons I try to avoid it. um, is you can't have rational conversations, and you can't functionally. A lot of my work, in the national security element is um, threat analysis, threat prediction, um, and then fairly quite accurate with it because of, say, the personality approach, whatever else. But if you can't look at where something is going to end, you can't prevent it getting there. And it feels often like we're on a railroad. And even though we could see the cliff, we're still going to go towards it. It's like we could just stop the train.
Yeah.
And this is how we put the brakes on. And it's the idea that you can't talk to the enemy or your perceived enemy or the other side, or you can't try to look at a perspective and say, okay, how did we get here and how do we get out? And so in some conversations I've had with the IAEA recently, because obviously it's we have the economic background, and there's sort of an adjunct to the work that we've done in other countries and are doing in other countries. They recognize that there is an economic challenge. They recognize that that the defunding is happening, and so you can have a conversation. You can, because they have concerns and they don't understand everything themselves. But the way we approach this idea that, if you're not on our side, you're on their side. Even you can't have neutrality now. And it's just like, well, maybe we should, not to so much as Ukraine or to wherever. Some countries I do a lot with Central Asia, and their economies are 70% dependent on Russia, and they're quite sophisticated countries. They recognize their economies have potential or whatever else, and their attitudes: we want to be friends to everyone and enemies to no one. They've never started wars, but you can't say back off from Russia. Okay, America, can you take 70% of our economy?
Yeah.
No. So we have to do what? We have to burn our economy down to take a stance that we're not in a position to take, and we're not really. They're not a vital cog of Russia's war machine. They're not. It's immaterial. Come on, you're just making trouble at this point, and now you're just creating adversity and forcing people to choose a choice that was not necessary to be made. So we need to get smarter on how we deal with foreign policy. I used to think that maybe the day that aliens would come would be a day that could unite humanity. I look at climate change, and I'm like, planet's burning down, wildfires everywhere. We still can't have a sensible conversation on that. So there's nothing that can save us. And so when I look at economic development now is I'm working with countries that show a willingness to be forward thinking, to be policy innovative, for growth, but to be a lake of where we could perhaps make some change. Because if you could do it, then you can have other countries that have been perceived as impossible. Oh, they did it, we can too. It's like, and a lot of this stuff is really just policy. And it's how do you I'll actually give a good example of Taliban. It's not what I was thinking of. Taliban supposedly created a new economic commission, and they are allegedly going to go out and talk to the chambers of commerce and businessmen and everything else. That's actually the right thing to do. And ordinarily someone would say, well, the Taliban said you should denounce the Taliban all the time. It's like, well, if you're really doing it, you need to consult with the businesses, with ordinary business. You say, where do you have friction? Where is it difficult to pay your fees? Where does government bureaucracy cause us problems? Where does it slow us down? Because that's the advice I would give any other country. Talk to the people who are using the government resources and remove friction so you can have more velocity on trade. Velocity is everything in an economy. And if your border policies reduce the movement of goods, like you see between Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan, you got to fix that. Because now your velocity is down. If you don't export, you have no GDP. It's really simple. Sorry, it's a bit of a wandering, but I don't like the hardline divisive way we have in media politics. Everything is just, choose a hill and die on it. Well, I don't really want to go on the hill. It's not very good up there.
There's a couple of things I want to say back to you on this, because it's important that we expand this conversation, because you've laid down so much gold, and I don't know if everybody can understand what you just said. One of the things is yeah, we tend to take people to the brink, and you have to decide white or black. Nothing in this world is white or
Right.
black. Like the Taliban is not universally evil. And by the way, they have
No.
a different problem set to solve that I guarantee you and I couldn't solve. We couldn't go be vice president and president of Afghanistan and rule it any better than those guys could. There's just no way. So we have to
No.
understand they have a different problem set, hugely complex. To go into Valley 1 versus Valley 2 versus Valley 3 and have the same solution, that is not happening. And here's the thing.
No.
The Taliban can't just walk in with Valley 1, Valley 2, Valley 3 and walk out safe. They cannot do that. They have to slow down. And so these things are not as easy as we want them to be. Second thing I wanted to say is America has put the same people through the last 20, 25 years, and they've all come up and they've all graduated, and they've had the same
Mm-hmm.
wrong ideas over and over again. They've screwed a
Mm-hmm.
lot of stuff up. And so they are the same people. I mean, look, our Secretary of Defense twice during this administration has said, I don't know how many Americans are there, nor can I protect them. And he's still Secretary of Defense. He's also the guy that pulled us out of Iraq. And it's like, hey, man, at some point,
That's so
you're not,
complex,
you're
that
not
one.
doing that great. And so we have
So
a lot of
complex.
these little,
That one's a little interesting. Because the first time
yeah,
in August, they started to talk about the American detainees. Blinken briefly mentioned them in January. I
yeah.
can't talk about it too much, but I do have permission to talk about the detainees from those relevant in the states expressly, because I wasn't allowed to talk about
Hmm.
it. Some of those guys have been there for over a year, and there's Canadians,
Yeah.
Australians, and others. Why is no one talking? And we know,
Yeah.
we've known, but now we choose in August to come out with this.
Hmm.
But you are right, and something else you said about the Taliban. So if you look at the supreme leader, his circle is the Norzai tribe, and so all the power in the Taliban is reflected again off of tribal relationships. The Haqqanis being from another area, and Kandaharis, the Norzais, and everybody else, and they are still nepotistic, and power is still laked in the tribes. And so you get the disparity between Kabul and Kandahar at the moment. So they absolutely have their own internal dynamics that they need to deal with and resolve if they want to govern Afghanistan. And they are at present the de facto government. And so that's what the world has to deal with if it chooses to deal with it, which I don't really believe that we do. I think we're preparing for what I used to term the hard exit. But to look at them and to present them as a homogenous entity is incorrect. They are not.
Yeah.
And they're not homogenous on many issues, on aspects of education, on aspects of what they see in society, on aspects of economy. And they themselves have created an Iranian style form of government, which is not necessarily even conducive to their own Pashtun culture. Which has used mechanisms like lawyer yogas and other mechanisms for decision making, and then they've installed a clerical system with the supreme leader and his 17 advisors. So even they have to work out a lot, and so
Right.
I watch this all the time.
Yeah.
I watch
And when
diplomats
it's
in the
not
West
working, they
fail.
have mechanisms to overthrow themselves too. Like there's that government has to work, right? And if it doesn't stay in power, even if it's a different form of Taliban leadership. That if you can't satisfy the people, they will throw you out. That's
I mean, it's
how it works.
a movement that's functionally based I- on a rural working class, a Pashtun rural working class. And the moment the rural Pashtun is no longer satisfied with the leadership, then they are out.
Right.
No, I mean it
Yeah.
has impact on the lives of Afghans, the rights of women and education, and all these other things, and the economy itself, and um, you know the inhibition of people achieving their potential, one might say.
Yeah.
which is something I'm always morally and ethically against. But at the same time, we are facing a situation which is compounding year on year with
Mm.
the famine risks, the health risks, the malnutrition risks, and we've seen massive defunding of the food programs. UN previously in May had raised $4.6 billion, of which they had 5%. Then in June, they slashed out 1.4 billion of the budget, cutting it down to 3.2. And so now they have raised 25% of that, being 70% of the original, which is 800 million. So you've gone from 4.6 billion as the need basis to 800 million you got. That's a humanitarian crisis going to happen.
Yeah.
And so if there's any hope of mitigating that, then that
Yeah.
is incumbent on changing, on both sides, changing how they speak to each other.
Yeah.
That is, the IAEA has to lean forwards, and the
They
international
have to.
community has to come away from how they've entered the conversations, which the IAEA perceives as demand-based, even though I guess the IAEA does the same thing, saying, take us to the blacklist, take us to the sanctions, and da-da-da-da. But there's, 30 million people, I think is the current figure, that are at risk of a population of 38 million. I mean, it's dire.
Yeah.
And spinning up the resources to do that, aid is logistics. And there's a safety and security
Yeah.
that comes with that.
What a problem.
Um,
Yeah. And one of those jobs that doesn't exist in Afghanistan is tax collector. Like they can't raise their own money to run their own show. Like that's not a thing, right? And so it's all got to be hodgepodge together, and they can't do that. So
no, I mean, they don't
yeah.
have the expertise nor the infrastructure. The brain drain. This is another thing that people don't understand about economies. Is that the number one attractor for an economy is talent.
Yeah.
And that's for retention even of domestic people. More so than wages, taxes, everything else is talent, access
Yeah.
to talent. That's where you
Yeah.
move, internally in a country. And if you can't attract talent and retain it, you can't build a country. You just can't. It's not there. And so the position that they're in without, it's just not viable. And so we come to people would tell me that I'm being pessimistic or whatever else. And I laid a timeline out from the May conference in Doha, which we worked on a lot. Was by August we'll start CT funding. So we come into the new financial year, September 30th. Normally, you'd see a massive run of companies of people trying to get unspent money. It's being diverted to Ukraine, or it's being reintegrated into the U.S. budget. It's not being spent in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
And then once we hit September 30th, whatever else, New Year, presidential election cycle, no one's going to care. Right? So it was like, here's your runway. And this is where we push the line of the approach of saying, okay, the Taliban have told us over and over again what they are. They are a puritanical, Quranic, Deobandi Pashtun government. Now, if one is, so you can't talk about hate and stuff with the Taliban. So if you want to talk about Islamic jurisprudence, you've got to be Quranic. But then you've got to put diplomats in there or people that can negotiate that understand Islamic law. That just doesn't happen. Then you need to have the conversations, where does Islamic law and international law intersect, so we can come to agreement on these things and take some stuff forward. And some of the significant people in the Islamic Emirate agreed with that, but nobody did anything. Nobody said, here's a problem we can solve, and recognize that there is compatibility. There's many Islamic governments around the world that work perfectly well. And they are capable of it. I mean, the economic power in the GCC, even as they diversify away from oil, the balance sheets of these countries, the agility of their investment funds, you'll see them turning up in sports games around the world. This place is, the GCC is outperforming everywhere else. Yes, Islamic countries can be perfectly capable of running successful, innovative economies.
That's a great point.
But every day we run the clock down, the money isn't coming back. So now we're going to say, okay, what happens when the money leaves Afghanistan? And then people say, well, we can't abandon them. Well, we did.
Yeah.
And have you seen Yemen? That's 38 million people. The difference is Yemen is you can at least send some money to feed a kid or you'll get some Hollywood celebrity, Sean Penn, will come on and make a video.
Yeah.
Doesn't happen. It can't happen with Afghanistan. You can't get money into the country. So how do you deal with that? You can't even get a pop. You can't. Then, seeing the evac community and the humanitarian community around Afghanistan, I know people buying people chickens. I see people just send ordinary civilians doing everything they can to protect Afghans from poverty. And I see it every day, and I see the struggles they go through. I see people spending their life savings every day, filling the void that State Department should be filling. And it's been that way since the start. But to go back to the withdrawal, I mean, I was talking to Jeroa a lot through July, and I was on the Doha process itself for some aspects. So seconded. I pulled out at a point. I didn't like where it was going. And I was brought in because I told if I didn't do it, they asked of me, then the Talibs would withdraw from Doha and I'd go back to war. I'm like, okay, I had best do something. But I mean, I personally wrote a paper on the 25th of July that warned of the imminent, I'm trying to find the right word to describe how the Taliban rolled over Afghanistan in those 2 weeks. But I warned it was coming. It was clear, apparent, and and then I would talk to people in Jeroa like, they'll never leave. They'll never leave. And I'm like, it's coming. And the realization came when about maybe a week before or 10 days before the US just stopped sending money. Because normally they would send money every week or every couple of weeks for the budget, like they do with the Taliban now. Basically the same. The money didn't turn up. And then they were running out of bullets. Like Herat ran out of bullets. And they were scrambling for resupply, begging from anywhere. They just left to be rolled over. But that belief until that last second that the Americans were leaving, the Americans didn't even tell the British they were leaving. The British woke up one morning and the Americans were pulling out of Bagram. They didn't tell them.
Yeah.
So do you think we're going to, the Taliban are really coming to that same point now where the international community has lost all patience with the inability to engage. And once they've lost patience, you can't keep saying, well, we're going to keep putting money into this. And what we're seeing as far as the West is concerned is reversion. Reversion on education, reversion on these things, reversion, beard laws coming back, whatever else, reversion. And then when that stops, there's no money. And then say, well, what about all those minerals? Do we really care?
Right.
We'll be pulling with the amount of seawater, $5 a kilo. Do we really care? And they'll say, what about Russia and China? Well, Russia can't afford it. China's pretty skittish in reality. And it's like, well, they'll build railroads or whatever else. Let them try.
Yeah, that's the thing, right?
Let them try.
Yeah. Right. Have they been there?
20 years yeah, 20 years there. And you think that ETIM ain't going to hit you?
My God.
You're going to try and mine the gas in the north. ETM will smack you 6 ways to Sunday.
Yeah. It is an exceptionally rough country to do anything in that involves anything complicated. Driving down the road, have you been there? No, I mean, is there a road there? Oh, come on. Yeah. One of the other things you said, and I've got you over an hour. Can you give like the 5-10 minutes for me? Because I want to ask you about this.
I'm really enjoying the conversation. Just keep going as long as
you talked. Because we both come from a world where threat is a thing, and one of the things is at least from the American point of view, and you have to have seen this. Threat is intoxicating. It's all encompassing, and so it's all we see. And one of the things I would do. Look, I was a counterintelligence agent, right? And what I learned is that because everybody is focused on threat, if I looked at the win-lose metric from everything except for threat, there was so much gold to just be picked up. Like, hey, boss, you see this? Hey, you see that? I could out collect everybody because I refuse to look at threat. And then there's another rule. This is a Pete rule. The worst way to find the bombs is to say, where are the bombs? And so I would find all kinds of threat stuff by simply not looking for it. And like, hey, and I would say, look, I'm here to ask questions. Yes, I am a spy, and I'm going to collect all the time. But if I ask you a question you don't want to answer, don't answer. I'm not here to harm anybody. I'm here to help. And all of the guys who were there to do that would be like, why do you tell them that? Like, because it's true. And I just want to
Yeah.
help people. And so I would find out things all the time. And here's what would happen is because I focused on trust and I was honest, and I would say, my name is Pete. I'm from California. I really am here to help you.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't say, my name is Craig. And I would, I would just be honest.
You went with true
Um,
name.
yeah, I would like use my name and I would be honest with who I was. And no matter where I was in the country, if you met me, meet the same guy, right? Because those guys all know each other too.
Hmm.
And what would happen is this: they would start to introduce me within their network, and I would meet people that nobody else knew. And then here was the way I flipped the game completely: was if I met VIPs, I would say, "I'd love to meet with you on your terms, but I also would love to have you come to our place. Can I
Yep.
buy you lunch in our chow hall?" And they're like, "You'll bring me on the American camp," and I would set it up ahead of time, and I would walk that VIP right on the American camp like they were a VIP,
Hmm.
and I would set it up and I'd walk them on like the respected guests that they were. Like, this is a very important man. You're a very important man. You're going to walk right on this camp and no one's going to say boo to you except for say, hello, sir. And they would do that. And I'd take them into the chow hall and I would blow their mind with air conditioning and ice cream and
Yep.
muffins. I'd be like, fill your fucking pockets, man. And the guy would be like, you're all right, and they would like me because I was
Yep.
being cool to them. And then there was a couple things that happened. One, their phone would never stop ringing because they're very important, and my interpreter would just
Yep.
listen and get a sense for what was talking, and we would have these conversations. I would also let the commander know I'm going to have a little meeting off hours in the chow hall at 3 p.m., for example.
Yep.
And so he'd come by and be like, who are you talking to, Pete? And I'm like, this is, influential dude so and so, and be like, hey, pleasure to meet you. So now they both have met each other. Someone that,
Hmm.
and like, the two shops like, how did you meet that guy? And I'm like, well, I'm not an asshole and I don't focus on threat. And that ability to do that opened
Yep.
up the whole world to me. And those guys would pass me around in their network as
Hmm.
someone who was trustable and could talk and I could understand what their problems were. Because that's all I just wanted to know, what are your problems? Like, what's one thing you and I could partner on? If I could go
Yep.
talk to the boss right now, we could fix it today. And they're like, here's a problem. And I'm like, how do we involve your government? And they're like, oh, you know what? Here's a problem. Here's a problem right now. You, me, the government, and the boss, we could all solve, I bet, today.
Yep.
And I would take those to the boss. We go to the government, and a lot of the time, the next day, solved. And that's what made me valuable. They would pass me around, but I never thought about the threat part of it. And so sometimes I'd be in
Hmm.
Afghan dudes' cars with no other Americans around, and they would take me
Hmm.
place to place, but safe because I'm within their network.
Yep. I mean, I always looked at the big armors as big bullet magnets. I never wore
Yeah.
body armor. Always traveled in thin skins. Um, because I always looked at it like, yo, you're someone worth shooting if you kind of kit it up and drive around. And it also puts a barrier between those that you're talking to.
Right.
And I agree with you wholeheartedly that when you're coming in to talk to somebody about trust, you don't get that you're not there to impose will, on the enemy. And the threat is intoxicating because it's also so politically powerful and it diverts resources and puts budgets and money and everything else. And it's easy to become intoxicated is such a great way to describe it. It's easy to become overwhelmed with the idea of the fear of the threat,
Yeah.
um, and to not understand, well, what's the decision making process that is leading somebody to take a violent action.
Right.
Um, and if we don't understand that, then we can't start talking about solutions. Not even solution, that's a wrong word to describe it. How do you decelerate violence?
Mm.
Um, because, and to someone who's willing to undertake an act of violence has been brought into a state of mind or being where they feel the violence is rational. And the violence is the only choice that they have to express, uh, you know, an objective or a need or whatever one wants to put it. So we just we, we don't look at how we slow that down. So everyone take a minute and say, is this necessary? I
Right.
don't. I've been thinking more and more about this lately. I don't really think that invasion works. Um, the reality of it, we saw it fail in Iraq. We saw it fail in Afghanistan. Whatever once was called intervention, the deployment of a large amount of troops from one country to another, um, because asymmetric warfare is so cheap. Now, when you look at Ireland, um, the real numbers of the IRA at its peak, being generous, it's probably 350 active guys. Of those, 50 mattered. Of those 50, 5 tied up 30,000 British soldiers and intelligence officers for decades. Right? And those 5 guys ran circles around the British. It is too cheap to create instability. Problem with that, and this is a problem the Taliban face, is, you'll know this saying: you can turn a farmer into a militant, but you can't turn a militant back into a farmer. So once you've taught someone that they can use violence as a tool of power or political gain, and even if you take power by those means, unless your unit transforms effectively into a political body, then anyone that becomes unhappy in that movement, i.e., ISIS splitting from Al Qaeda or whatever factions we may see pop up, they can use those same tools of violence against you, and they're very, very good at it. So you've created your own threat. And I just don't see a way that makes invasion functional if your other side can, we could use the Russia-Ukraine example. If Russia did take Ukraine and Ukraine went asymmetric, it's going to be a shit show. You just keep bleeding them out. It's your homeland, right? It's your house that you're fighting for. You're not going to abandon that. You don't get to go home because the occupying force always has to be in a foreign territory. So it just doesn't. And then the asymmetric warfare itself, once it becomes victorious, is its own enemy. I guess something to touch on, I don't think a lot of people understand, and this is something I read about recently. And this is a paper that's made its way through a lot of political circles all around the world. Is that, and this goes back to, and Ukraine may face this in the presidential elections with the withdrawal. Not quite the same way, but when you look at what happened with the withdrawal agreement, and I very much, by the way, believe that was Donald Trump's pursuit of a Nobel Peace Prize. Why he did that, Abraham Accords, peace in the Middle East, and withdrawal from Afghanistan, that can't turn him down. That aside, it was the Irish model. We'll talk about the IRA there. Is that the idea is that you bring the Taliban into political process, and by doing so, then they have to relinquish certain tools they used before, such as violence. The problem is the IA is not the IRA. And so this idea that we could get them to the table, that we could take photographs, drink chai, and meet in hotel rooms in Doha doesn't work. I mean, the idea that these guys who fought against Western forces for 20 years, living in caves, hiding from drones, hiding from, and then striking when they could, would accept our values over a cup of tea? You out of your mind? In what world?
Georgetown, in Georgetown or Boston, in that world.
An unfortunate world. And so when they realize that doesn't work, then how do you get out? Because where I see we are now. And that is, okay, well, you continue the game of engagement. You just say, well, it all didn't work, and we tried, and we were lovely and great, and we opened the doors for you, and you just chose not to walk through them. So I think we're actually working towards a structural failure that saves face, but at enormous cost to the people of Afghanistan. And that's the great tragedy of all of this, is that we made a stupid decision based on an improper read of the IAA as to what they would concede, and now we have to extricate ourselves from that, and it will be a terrible consequence.
One of the things I worry about with Ukraine is again, as we insert our corrupting force, Iraq wasn't sectarian violence. I talked to so many Iraqis. They're like, they're Sunni, they're Shia. That's political. That's what that is. It's political parties. But now there really is sectarian difference there, and there's a lot more Iranian influence, right? So we actually created that shit. And when you look at Ukraine, the more we mess around with that, and you're taking a country that had a lot of corruption before, and we're like, hey, they're getting rid of it. Are they? I don't know. I know that there are active court cases right now where the people in court have to exit Ukrainian court to go to European court, whether it's arbitration or any of the many European courts, because they can't get a fair case in Ukraine, which to me tells me, hey, and there's articles about this. I mean, we don't hear about it here in America, but if you look in the European news, you see like, oh my God, look, someone is controlling Ukrainian courts. There's smoke in that area. And so if there's smoke, there's probably something going on. And so if you have to go to the European courts and people are winning in European courts against the Ukrainian courts, and then you come back and the Ukrainian courts like, F your decision, you're like, oh boy, we have a real problem with corruption still if the court
Hmm.
system isn't obliging European courts now. And I don't know, man,
Hmm.
I don't know how we fix that. And so that turns into really a tribalization of a place that isn't tribal, and if these places aren't able to satisfy private contracts and different,
Hmm.
this is private property that was taken away and now we're not
Yeah.
going to compensate that person, that is going to cause enormous problems because there is rule of law there. There are courts, there are external courts that hold those courts responsible. It's going to be really
It's
bad.
yeah, and this is what as we come back, it's I use um, the metaphor of gravity
Mm,
a lot in understanding geopolitics when I look at things. I look at maps a lot and I think about gravity. And when you add money and resource and power and platform or whatever factor that you add, you're changing the natural gravity of the society.
right.
And when you take a failed state, whether that's Somalia or wherever, that then essentially becomes a black hole
Hmm.
that draws other states into it because of its negative force.
Yeah.
Um, not spurts back violence. As we see sweeping Africa from sort of west to east, and then it'll belt down with more instability. Um, but if we don't look at the gravitational effects, I mean, you can look at investment in that same way. Investment is an act of economic gravity. You're bringing in, you're building a factory, you're creating jobs, you're creating a gravity well. And these things can attract more things around them. Cafes, restaurants, as people get more to absorb what that is producing. But if you can't absorb that money, then you have problems. If you
Yeah.
can't, and you've reshaped power, you've reshaped order. It's not an enviable position to be Ukraine. Obviously nobody wants. I do believe in sovereignty, and it's not an enviable position to be, but to portray this as to be a perfect implementation of a proxy war with a zero negative outcome is highly unlikely. And I think it would be irresponsible to suggest otherwise. As and it's not to criticize anyone's right to defend anything. It's just these things get really complex. Every nation should have its right to defend its borders, sure.
Yeah.
But to put in that amount of resource, I mean, I've mapped out many terrifying possibilities that can come from that. Um, I mean, if you wanted to cause havoc, you just take one of those javelins and go and light up the Louvre. That'd be the cheapest operation ever. And so, there's so much weaponry in there, and the idea, and we talked about this before, and it's that I had difficulties when I just commented once that the idea that saying that no diversion has taken place and diversion is impossible is foolish, because if an instance of diversion occurs, then you have to, then we have a whole riot on that. But if we look at the controls that we have and we safeguard, if we look at the controls for corruption, and we look honestly at these things, then we can do a better job. Ukraine can do a better job of defending itself if munitions are making it to the right place, things aren't being stuck in warehouses, and all these things happen. Then that not transparency, that you know audibility or performance or awareness or mitigation
Right.
of corruption will make the whole Ukraine's territorial defense of itself much more effective. And then would give a more stable future for Ukraine because the organisms of state haven't been destabilized by this corrupting influence. And that's not easy to do, but you have to kind of. It's like a company, you got to governance is hard, but you got to do it.
Yeah.
Got to do it.
It's true. And listen, I've had you for an hour and 20 minutes, so I'm not going to keep it any longer. But
Oh, it's been
we
delightful.
could do this. This is it's great to be able to talk to someone that gets it, and you have so many areas where we don't overlap, and so it's great to hear your thoughts on these things. And the Ukrainian thing is hyper complex, and what it is not is simple. And when someone
No.
says this is simple, we should or shouldn't be doing this. I don't know. I don't know if that's ever going to be true. And we are far from a solution, and we are far from a stable thing. And this will be the last thing I say, and I'll let you have the floor.
Yeah.
No matter what happens, when this all calms down, Ukraine and Russia are still going to be neighbors. Belarus is going to be right there. Poland's going to be
Yeah.
right there. Turkey's going to be right there. Uzbekistan, Western Europe is still going to need energy. All of these
Yeah.
things are going to have to work together in concert to make a stable European continent.
It's the largest central landmass in Europe. It's, it is a hugely important component of Europe. Probably underrealized economic potential in the past due to corruption. And all these, and to be fair to that, a number of these states came out of the post-Soviet world, the gangsterism of the 90s that happened in Russia and that bled into Ukraine. And then, there's a lot of Russian Ukrainians at business relationships that have nothing to do with the war, nothing to do with the violence. And so, Ukraine being in a corrupt position is in somewhat contextually understandable. Kazakhstan's had to struggle through it with the Nazarbayev regime, and then come out of that, and then you can become forward-looking. But when you put this much pressure on an economy and a society, and this much fluidity of money and unaccountability, and then say our own corruption and incompetence that will drive reconstruction and create a new layer of corruption. As people compete for contracts and use relationships or whatever else to do, as they did in Iraq and Afghanistan, to shore things up so they remain the incumbent, these things will happen. But I guess the difference between people like us talking about things is, you were in Iraq and Afghanistan, you lived it, right? You've seen the cost of war. You've seen the cost of violence. You've met the people. When you meet the people, they're just people. They're great. I know so many brilliant Afghan minds that are so much smarter than me. So much. And you just discover that these people don't want violence. They aren't your enemy. They're just people.
They're just people.
And more that when you see that, the cost of destabilization. The cost of how we do things. You've lived and seen how when the engine spins up and the policy, and again I use the metaphor once before, it's like a ship. And once the ship gets a massive inertial energy behind it, turning that around, if you've made a mistake, is enormously difficult. It's like people who talk about war and violence that have never seen war and violence. It's like someone wisely once said, people talk about gunfights being cool to those who haven't been in one.
It's true.
It is.
Yeah.
And I think when you have this humanistic understanding of the cost of war, and also the cost of the negative impacts, and being honest about the negative impacts of interventions and this amount of money and force, these are really, really important conversations that I'm certainly thrilled to have had tonight. I haven't had someone express ideas the way you have before. It's really refreshing for me too, because you're giving me a lot more to think about. And I think that's where these podcasts are great, is where I'm hearing things in a perspective I haven't heard before that then becomes part of how I will approach certain conversations that I have in my own political realm. So tremendously thrilled to be on, and glad that we could have this conversation, and hopefully some people can appreciate the directions that we come from, because on first reactions, people might not like what we say, but I have to sometimes say, actually, it's not my job for you to like what I say. It's my job to try to tell you things to help you make better decisions. It's not my job to be liked.
Yeah. And it's oftentimes the folks who've had to lay on rocks and sleep in bookcases and go on the side of the mountain where they don't have ice cream. Those guys often know more than the folks who are like, I was in the Garden of Alexander. That person doesn't know shit. I'm going to just tell you right now.
Yeah, I mean, you learn, you have the difference between knowledge and information. You have information from education, but you learn by living.
Yeah. All right, stand by. I'll be right back to you. Hey, thanks everybody for watching. Here we go. Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here
are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly. Thank you so